Right, well, here we are. This is going to be fun. I'm Matt Lynette, and I'm very sorry that we're beginning late. This is entirely my fault. I didn't have the discipline to extricate myself from a conversation, and as such, I was ill-prepared to begin streaming. But the nature of the conversation was such that I thought it would make sense to share it with you guys here. I'm just going to see if anyone happens to be watching. And as soon as I see that we have somebody watching, we'll be able to continue. All right. So the basics of the conversation I was having, there were a few questions that the person I was conversing with was asking. And they are some of the most thought-provoking ones were, where are we? Can I accept, where are we? Can I accept someone, for instance, to be a leftist, to be equally intelligent, and to not be deluded? And that's actually a very interesting question. I would definitely say equally intelligent, certainly. Not deluded. It depends. Completely depends on the motivations for their leftist views. And then the next question is, can I accept someone can be not religious, equally intelligent, and not deluded? Of course, given that I am religious myself. And my answer to that is easily yes. With one particular caveat that I believe every single human being in the world is religious. I believe every single human being in the world is religious. And why do I believe that? Well, I have to give you the framework by which I understand religion. And so I'll give you the definition. So the first commandment, at least according to Christianity, is you shall have no other gods, or you shall have no other gods before me, presumably given to Moses by God on Mount Sinai. And the question this leads to, the first question that Luther asks when explaining this, is what does this mean? And his answer includes a different understanding of a God than many people wind up generally having. But if you go and use this particular framework for defining God, everyone gets back into the corner of being religious in some way. There we go. There we go. I can have the appropriate spacing. Okay, so what this means is that you shall have me alone as your God, meaning, of course, the God of Abraham, and that means worshiping him on his terms, whatever that might mean. And I don't need to get into it for the purpose of this discussion, because the question was being who's religious. What is the meaning of this and how is it to be understood? And Luther says, what does it mean to have a God? Or what is God? And then he answers as follows. A God means that from which we are to expect all good, and in which we are to take refuge in all distress. So to have a God is nothing other than trusting and believing him with the heart. I have often said that the confidence and faith of the heart alone make both God and an idol. So make God your God, or makes an idol your God. If your faith and trust is right, then your God is also true. On the other hand, if your trust is false and wrong, then you do not have the true God. For these two belong together, faith and God. Now I say that whatever you set your heart on and put your trust in is truly your God. And therefore it is possible, it's entirely possible to have multiple gods with this particular framework and understanding. And so I would go and say that by that understanding of God and the idea of having a God in some sense, essentially necessitates that everyone is either religious or dead. I mean, that would mean that in many aspects you could say an infant, the God of an infant would be mom, right? The infant believes and trusts that mom will take care of him, that mom will change his diapers, that mom will give him milk, that mom will take care of all these different things. Then you can have people having money or mammon as God, as understood by the Bible, which is basically that which money and that which it can purchase. You know, having your trust in that and believing that that's going to ultimately be your well, having that as your as the focal point of your life, having that as what you think is going to help you in every aspect, or in an insufficient number of aspects that you wind up putting your trust in it. So I would say that many people at many times, myself included, probably have this as a God. So there are many different ways of being religious, and I think the most simple way is simply by having a God. So I don't think that having a God precludes anybody from being intelligent, because I don't know if there is any way of experiencing the human condition without having one in the first place. And the other question is, well, what is leftism? Leftism is, in that sense, another God. And now, of course, I'm using leftism to mean, in this case, authoritarianism, collectivism, Marxism in some weird way can also be encompassed here. But the big reason that I'm saying that this could also be a God is because you believe that, okay, if all we do is follow these rules, if all we do is structure society according to a particular set of principles, and here they are, we will have heaven on earth, we will have utopia, we will have lion lying down with the lamb, snake lying down with the baby, and all will be well in the world. and there will be no poverty. John Lennon's song Imagine will be playing in the background everywhere, and we will all be happy. That is, of course, the communist dream. And the idea that society naturally evolves from a free market to capitalism to cronyism to whatever to socialism, and ultimately, over many generations of that, to communism, is simply a fatalistic view of the world in which people trust, in which people who like communism trust, and therefore I would say that this particular idea is a god. This particular idea is a god of sorts. Ah, hello, Todd. Todd says, it's developmental. It develops as a person matures. For example, we do almost everything with words. We talk to ourselves, therefore we exist. We become word creatures. In some extent, to some extent, I will agree that one can make words a god, but it's interesting because we have different reactions to different kinds of words. And then if we go, like, what in the world are you supposed to then think if you go and you, for instance, pull out the Bible? There's a very interesting way of looking at the word, or a logos, here in the Bible. In the beginning was the Word, so logos, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, all things were made through him, and so on. And without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and in life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. So that's the Christian understanding of logos, is that ultimately it is. We will continue in verse 14 of John chapter 1. And it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. And so people believe, Christians believe, or Christians I think should believe, if they call themselves Christians in some sense, that logos itself became incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ. In the person of Jesus Christ. And of course, that is a claim that is at its core substantiable to a certain extent. To the same degree many other religious claims are substantiable, but ultimately it's something that needs to be taken as an article of faith. Something that needs to be taken as an article of faith. But so can many other such things, such as Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" statement. Ah, Todd, you say, I know that fictional personages require words for their existence. What is the terrifying real thing permeating us, especially evident when this character of words falls quiet? So, I don't know, because depending on what the words are, things can be very different. Things can be incredibly different depending upon what words one chooses to use. Although I do notice that, especially for people that have experienced some of life, the fiction that winds up being the most compelling to them happens to be the kind that somehow models or types reality pretty well, or some aspect of reality, perhaps exaggerates it. But then again, I'm not even going to look at exaggeration as necessarily a lie in one sense, in that sometimes it can serve as a great rhetorical tool to bring into focus a point that otherwise might be lost. And ultimately, every time we try to convey something with text, we wind up going and saying something in favor of something else. And so on. So we always wind up somehow being able to inadequately convey a reality, whether we're writing truth or fiction. And often I wonder how many fictional works are actually true stories that nobody would actually believe are true, because they're just that little bit more extreme than that which people are experiencing in day-to-day life. I'm here going back through our the chat I was having with somebody else. That chat was, at least according to my opinion, a pretty interesting one to have. I'm definitely looking forward to seeing if the person with whom I was chatting happens to show up to watch this stream. If said person happens to show up and is okay with revealing that he was the one with whom I was having the chat, I will give a brief recap of what it is that's taken place during the past 15 minutes or so. And then after finishing my water here, I'll be able to get a little more coffee and hopefully be a little more awake. And then after going and recapping all of this stuff, we'll be able to jump into the Iliad. We'll be able to jump into the second book of the Iliad specifically. What in the world is wrong with me? I can't open up a recent document here. And the ancients believed in a particular pantheon of gods. The ancient Greeks believed. So, and then people believed, of course, that gods gave them dreams, and that depending on who you trust and who your dream comes from, you can go and do things. And so, conveying these dreams is an easy way to manipulate people into doing what you want. It's a very easy way to manipulate people into doing what you want. Hello, David. Hello, Mr. Sanderson. How are you doing today? A common versus mystical. That's an interesting distinction to make. And one which I do not hold. Oh, hey, Christian. One of my recent comments to be a bit nosy, if not downright cold. Oh no. Whatever it is, I don't take I don't take responsibility for it. But yes, I see there are 3 of us here, so I will go and I will make my claim again that we are all religious according to my definition. And the definition is that to have a God is nothing other than trusting and believing him or it with the heart, whatever with the heart is supposed to mean. The confidence and faith alone make both God and an idol. If your faith and trust is right, then your God is also true. And if your faith and trust is wrong, then you do not have the true God, for these two belong together, faith and God. So a God means that from which we are to expect all good and in which we are to take refuge in all distress. That's the basic idea. So anybody that has anything from whom they're expecting good, or in whom one takes refuge in times of distress, they have a God. And so you can kind of back people into the corner of saying, well, however irreligious you say that you are, it's not that you're even necessarily an atheist. It's just that you are an atheist with respect to every single God that you do not choose or have for yourself. It's a different framework, Mr. Sanderson. Mr. Sanderson is not sure what I mean by this, and yeah, it's a very, very different framework, a different way of looking at the world in general than what many people have, because people do view religions as being more mystical in nature, and I would just as quickly say that somebody who trusts in, for instance, his morning coffee to get him through the day could very well have coffee as a god. If someone trusts in and expects all good from something, you could have your marriage being your god, or you can have your house being your god, or you can have money being a god, or you can have Zeus or Hera being your god, or you can have the God of the Bible being your god, or you can have your boss being your god. You can have all sorts of things being a god, or filling the particular role in life of God. That I claim, in other words, that acceptance of some sort of a deity is that integral to the human condition that it's impossible to be a human as we understand humanity and to simultaneously not have a God of some sort. So, or be a conscious human and not have a God. I don't know necessarily if you're unconscious how that works, necessarily speaking. So this is of course some people do say that to be religious you have to believe in a transcendent reality or universal metaphysical principle or law which is separate from the physical tangible world. And I would say that at the very core, everyone does believe in some sort of universal principle or law which is separate from the physical tangible world. We do that implicitly as soon as we impute value to something. As soon as we impute value to something, we impute a transcendent principle to our judgment, or we impute a transcendent principle. I don't know if impute is the correct word. We begin to predicate our behaviors and our functioning upon a transcendent principle. So it is impossible, I claim, to be able to completely avoid things that are transcendent and simultaneously have our faculty of reason intact. Like, how in the world do I know whether, for instance, it's a good idea for me to eat or not to eat? Well, I mean, there's this general principle that that food is good, but then what's to say that my life is actually good and worth preserving? Right? On the other hand, if I'm a big fat ball, or if I'm having blood sugar problems, what's to say that fasting for a while isn't a wise idea, isn't what I should be doing? And that's actually better for preserving my life. But still, there's this general idea that life is good, which is transcendent. Anyhow, I think that we're beginning to beat a dead horse now, and so we'll go back to this whole general idea of reading the Iliad we talked about Eurybates. Thersites. Oh boy, that was a mess. And all right, so we got through the point where Ulysses chastised Thersites in Book II of the Iliad. He seized, and with his scepter on the back and shoulders smote him, writhing to and fro. We've already gone through this, but I'll read it again. He wept profuse, while many a bloody whelk protuberant beneath the scepter sprang. All quelled he sat, and from his visage mean, deep sighing wiped the rheums. It was no time for mirth, yet mirth illumined every face, and laughing thus they spake 1,000 acts, illustrious both by well-concerted plans and prudent disposition of the host. Ulysses hath achieved, but this by far transcends his former praise, that he hath quelled such contumelious rhetoric profuse. The valiant talker shall not soon, we judge, take liberties with royal names again. So spake the multitude, then stretching forth the scepter, city spoiler chief arose. Ulysses him beside, herald in form, appeared Minerva, silent she enjoined to all, that all Achaea's sons might hear, foremost and rearmost, and might weigh his words. He then his counsel prudent thus proposed. So basically, he quelled a mutiny. He quelled a mutiny. That's ultimately what occurred. And the mutiny was given, as we discussed previously, or as we discussed last Thursday or Friday, depending upon where you happen to be in this world, did in a very bad rhetorical way, because he seized to, that is, Thersites seized to, or failed to in the first place, exemplify ethos. So he had the pathos, but he didn't wind up having the trust of people, and therefore he spoke in vain. So now we have Ulysses continuing. Atrides, monarch, the Achaeans seek to make thee ignominious above all. In sight of all mankind none recollects his promise, more instead famed Argos pledged, here to abide till Ilium, walled to heaven, should vanquished sink, and all her wealth be ours. No, now like widowed women or weak boys, they whimper to each other, wishing home. And home, I grant, to the afflicted soul seems pleasant, the poor seaman from his wife. 1 month detained, cheerless his ship and sad, possesses by the force of wintry blasts, and by the billows of the troubled deep, fast locked in port, but us the 9th long year. Revolving finds camp under Ilium still. I therefore blame not if they mourn beside their sable barks the Grecians, yet the shame that must attend us after absence long. Returning unsuccessful, who can bear? Be patient, friends, wait only till we learn if Calchas truly prophesied or not. For well we know, and I to all appeal, whom faith hath not already snatched away. It seems but yesterday, or at the most, a day or two before, that when the ships, woe fraught for Priam and the race of Troy, at Aulis met, and we beside the fount, with perfect hecatombs the gods adored, beneath the plane tree, from whose root a stream ran crystal clear. There we beheld a sign, wonderful in all eyes, a serpent huge, Tremendous spectacle with crimson spots, his back all dappled by Olympian Jove, himself protruded with foliage broad 8 sparrows younglings all. The newly feathered with their dam the ninth, the little ones lamenting shrill he gorged, while wheeling o'er his head with screams, the day bewailed her darling brood, her also next. He's a continuation. The speech that Ulysses continued with, it also foreshadows his own Odyssey, which is the subject of a later book. Not a later book in the Iliad, but it is a later book, also attributed to Homer. And the whole idea is that in addition to the pantheon of gods, Ulysses held home in very high regard. Getting home to his wife, getting home to his fields, getting home was very important to Ulysses, and he wasn't able to get home, and the story of the Odyssey is his journey home. His journey to where it was that he belongs. So getting to be where you belong can also be something that we trust in, something that we hope for, something from which we expect all good. Home can be a god for some, according to the framework that we were discussing earlier. Mr. Sanderson asks, what if we argued that self-interest is not based on a system of ethics, but rather one of preference? Well, preference implies a value system anyway. Preference implies value system, and then we wind up, if we go and we think about, okay, what would a universal law be? That would be something that could be applied to, or I don't necessarily know, forced upon others would work. Like, let's say this, if we go and take a principle like don't kill or don't murder. Okay, but then where's the line between subjective and objective? Mr. Sanders says subjective rather than objective, and this is why it's very, very difficult to have discussions about politics and religion and finances, is because it all gets, or that's why these are all kind of taboo subjects, is because they go and hit the core of who you are as a person, because you ultimately have a value system that deals with them in some way, shape, or form. Your value system, or my value system, or whoever's value system can it ultimately does boil down to what is my preference. My value system tells me what I prefer. But then, if there are things that I prefer to the extent that I think they should be universal laws, like do not take innocent life, like we can agree, I'm not going to take your life, you don't take my life, and the penalty for taking life is so severe that, well, you would really need to seriously weigh whether taking someone's life is worth it. If we all hold different values, what dictates what the objective values are? Well, that's a good question now, isn't it? And I would definitely say that this is why many wars are fought. In fact, this is that the fact that that conundrum exists, the fact that you need to even ask that question, is that which underpins every single war, every single fight. That would be my claim. And Todd Boothby says, man hides behind his tongue and his tongue cuts his throat. I'm pantheistic, Freemason. Okay, I'm trying to figure out how one could be pantheistic and Freemason. If I understand correctly, in order to be Freemason, you must believe in one God and only one God. But whatever. That is, if it's possible to be a Freemason and simultaneously have pantheistic views, then I will definitely learn something new here. So it's interesting that here Ulysses winds up going and basically saying, okay, let's get our fighting done. Who knows whether this is actually going to work, but let's just go to war, get this thing done, and go home. Appealing both to the pantheon of gods and to people's desire to get home, if they happen to have it, if they happen to have something drawing them, wife, children, lands, whatever it may be. Is it panentheist or pantheist? Okay. That's interesting. Learn something new if you can. It's awesome. Ha! I'm scaring everyone away. This is lovely. Oh well. Minor issue that I suppose that whoever doesn't want to watch doesn't have to watch. Anyhow, we'll continue with a few more lines from the Iliad, and then return to the subject of leftism, specifically leftism as a utopian ideology, or leftism as an integral part in one particular utopian ideology. But let's go and jump into the Iliad. We're at Book II, line 391. Why stand ye Greeks astonished, ye behold a prodigy by Jove himself produced, an omen whose accomplishment indeed is distant, but whose fame shall never die. E'en as this serpent in your sight devoured 8 youngling sparrows with their dam the 9th, so we 9 years must war on yonder plain, and in the 10th wide bulwarked Troy is ours. So spake the seer, and as he spake is done. Wait therefore, brave Achaeans, go not hence, till Priam's spacious city be your prize. He ceased, and such a shout ensued that all the hollow ships the deafening roar returned, of acclamation every voice the speech, extolling of Ulysses, glorious chief. So Agamemnon was king, but Ulysses was the chief. And I just gotta... Sorry, I just got a really, really funny message. So Ulysses has the role of chief, I would argue, predominantly because he has mastered this idea that the best way to ride a horse is in the direction that it's headed. You can goad people on and gently steer, but going and attempting to derail something, attempting to carve a new path, attempting to do that, it needs to be undertaken with care and needs to, if you're going to set about doing that, you're going to need to set yourself up with a great context. You need to have a great amount of order to your thoughts, amass unto yourself a great amount of ethos, passionately, with pathos, expound upon it and don't lose them. So you have to go and combine all these different things in order to be able to get people to do something different. But if people are already going to war, encouraging them is considerably easier than going and convincing them to change tack. And if there is one simple plan that everyone can get on board with, as opposed to a more complicated, nuanced plan that leaves people either confused or unwilling to participate, the simple plan is often preferable. The simple plan is, we know we're going to have to war for 10 years. 9 years, we're not going to get anything, but we're just going to go through our 10 years of war. We're going to war, and we're going to sack Troy. And so it was easy to convince the Greeks to go do that by appealing to that which was sacred, to that which was important to them. It was very much a religious appeal that Ulysses made. We can talk then about, next time we'll talk about what Nestor said and how Atrides responded our next time. Todd says, believing in words can cut your throat with a paradox of subjectivity versus objectivity. The subjective, as if a cosmic joke, becomes the only true objective reality. Exactly, and so you wind up going and making an absolute statement like that. If you go and say, I'm absolutely sure there is no absolute truth, well, oops. You can go and go round and round that circle, and that circle's a really fun one to get into. And ultimately, you can go and have a lot of fun with people that didn't go think things through to that extent. I hope that I numbered the episode correctly. Is this really the 47th episode of CSC? Let me check. Well, we've been actually going for quite some time, 43 minutes and 5 seconds, and it doesn't feel like we've been going for long at all. It doesn't feel like we've been going for all that long at all, at least to me. Huh. Yeah, episode 46 was our last one, so that would make this one 47. So back to the theme of leftism and socialism, and why I would say that is a god, and that's an article of faith. I was actually reading the reason I say this is because the entire conversation that I was discussing at the beginning of the stream was precipitated by this particular piece. It was a certain Peter Orsman answered a question, what is your opinion on Dr. Jordan Peterson? And I'll put this into the chat for the sake of anyone who's interested in reading the article. Here you go. But I'll read it for anybody that doesn't want to navigate away from the stream. I'll read it for anybody that doesn't want to navigate away from the stream. And Peter says, when I first looked into Jordan Peterson, I didn't exactly think very much of him. He seemed to me to be someone in the mold of a standard intellectual, being inordinately opinionated on a number of topics and seemingly intent on enlightening the world with his thoughtful perspective. At any rate, I definitely didn't associate him with the pseudo-intellectual contagion that I would eventually recognize bound within the framework of his ideology. At that point, I saw him most noticeably as an opportunist, but fortunately one that seemed to come from a place of authenticity and genuine concern for the future of free speech. The leftist leniency toward identity politics was due for a counteracting movement at some point, and I had naively presumed that were it to take such a form as this articulate individual, it would be beneficial to the social fabric of our country. I hadn't thought that it would evolve into a mechanism through which misinformation would spread like wildfire, contributing to an ever-polarized nation in which the once traversable aisle would become an ocean of dissimilarity. I must say now, looking back at my rather innocent perspective, I now believe that I was quite wrong in my initial evaluation. The more I learned of Peterson, the more multidimensional my views became, gradually obtaining such nuance that they couldn't exactly be classified as either negative or positive, eventually growing into a mixed bag of unorganized thoughts, which appears to be the state they presume today. The much-needed silver lining seems to be that, regardless of whether or not your ideological principles align with his, you can't exactly claim Peterson to be an ideologue in the mold of Shapiro or Prager. Yet much like the aforementioned two, he seems to have obtained legions of fans who are willingly blind to the possibility he could in success, magnified by the fact that much of what he surmises borders on pure irrationality. This unfortunately reveals one of the great vulnerabilities of democracy. Terrible ideas expressed through persuasive verbosity can be more... I'll continue reading this later, but just the fact that this guy is so very articulate, he's very, very well put together. Like, he has one typo in an entire wall of text, and so on. And it was the instead of than or something like that. So literally a typo. But I don't understand how one can say, okay, the more multidimensional my views became, blah, 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 eventually growing into a mixed bag of unorganized thoughts, which appears to be the state they presume today. So a mixed bag of unorganized thoughts. And he says he can't classify it as either negative or positive, unless, of course, it started to, become more and more negative over time, in which case I could sort of understand it. But then he goes and 1, 2, 3 paragraphs later says, but before I provide an explanation for my overt negativity toward Peterson. So I don't see how you go from mixed bag to overt negativity, unless, of course, overt negativity means anything other than pure positivity. And allow me to preface the rest of this by saying I don't agree with Peterson on many things, and I think that, at least insofar as the scale of left and right goes in the United States, Jordan Peterson is far further to the left than I am. In fact, I would definitely not consider him a right-wing ideologue. I would not consider him right-wing. But this guy goes from saying that his views are nuanced. And because of the nuance of his views, he has a mixed bag of unorganized thoughts that are neither negative or positive about Peterson, but it's overtly negative. So, we go and continue here with what he says about on the positive side. In certain facets of academia, Dr. Jordan Peterson not only brings about a fascinating perspective on complex topics that wouldn't otherwise be articulated in such a manner, but he actually offers a medium through which struggling individuals can attain help, making himself an integral part of the therapeutic industry, whether he knows it or not. What I mean by this is that he appears to be imperative in the fight to spread much-needed information regarding life advice and self-help to populations that wouldn't normally have access to it. Be important, would work. Given as his audience contains the demographics least likely to receive it from traditional sources, such as therapy, I tend to think that Peterson's clean your room mantra might actually be of some utility. Whether these talks are wrapped up in some misleading political nonsense or not, I still think they are invaluable in our current social environment. Now, this doesn't go for the crux of his argument, but I think it's interesting that he goes that it's very obvious what the perspective of this guy is, or what the context of this guy is, because he believes that life advice and self-help are traditionally conveyed via therapy. Right? At least where I come from, those sorts of things should be, and have been for many generations, traditionally conveyed by the family. By family. So this guy is already coming from the perspective that having some sort of external hierarchy larger than the one that I would it's very likely that he has an idea that there's some sort of external hierarchy larger than the one that I would be excited about submitting to or be tolerant of without pushback would be. Furthermore, Peterson's talks on psychology-related subjects such as the works of Carl Jung are really quite fascinating and oftentimes will offer unique insight into the inner working of the human mind that wouldn't otherwise be gained from the reading of a standard textbook. This undeniably articulate and thoughtful nature makes him dangerously convincing as a public speaker, contributing greatly to his remarkable success in recent months, perhaps even to a fault. Okay, that wouldn't otherwise be gained from the reading of a standard textbook. Well, maybe it depends on what the standard textbooks are, but if you read Jung, and which I have, I'm not saying that I agree with everything Jung says either, but it does provide a framework of understanding the world, which is kind of important. But then again, what a lot of Jung says is not falsifiable, and so you wind up having to go and impute a different degree of explanation to the works of Jung than to something that is falsifiable. Something that has a null hypothesis. Jung does not pose a null hypothesis. But anyhow, unfortunately, all of this upside comes with a few substantial drawbacks. Peterson's comprehensive knowledge on intellectual topics invariably decreases the farther away from psychology you get, oftentimes manifesting itself in misguided lectures on philosophy, political ideology, and it seems to have even induced some rather absurd arguments with Sam Harris on the nature of truth, which leads us to the negative outlook on Peterson's influence. Now, this implies, of course, that the writer, as many of us do, and I would probably say that I feel this way about myself, thinks that obviously he knows better than Peterson about matters of philosophy, political ideology, and so on. Does he or does he not? I don't know. But I think that we'll find that he fails to pick up on some nuance while he goes and says this negative side thing. Because his beef with Peterson seems to be exemplified by one particular point. And that one particular point is actually something that I think is, from both a psychological and a sociological perspective, as well as just from a general perspective of understanding socialism, understanding communism, understanding Marxism, and understanding the way that society is progressing, well, I mean, all this stuff is integral. If Peterson better understood his boundaries as a thinker, or perhaps refrained from discussing topics related to philosophy in particular, it would be much to his benefit. While his beautiful articulation may conceal his ignorance to those who have already been convinced, anyone with half a mind can see through some of his more absurd ideas. Okay. An example of this is how he seems not to maintain a comprehensive understanding of postmodernist thought, and in particular its relation with Marxist philosophy, yet still sees fit to speak to its treacherous nature in front of dozens of college students. The claim Peterson essentially makes with regards to postmodernism, okay, so here he is actually attempting to represent Peterson's claim. And this might show that I have a different, I have a very different understanding of Peterson's claim than what Mr. Orsmond does. In fact, I would dare say that my understanding is, even though Mr. Orsmond goes and says, the more I learned of Peterson, the more multidimensional my views became, gradually obtaining such nuance that they couldn't exactly be classified as either negative or positive. He's setting himself up as an authority. I am nuanced. I know what Peterson doesn't. I have this stuff figured out. And then he goes and quickly misrepresents the position that Peterson has, which means that he's actually not as nuanced as he thinks that he is. And that is ultimately what really rubs me the wrong way. I'm perfectly fine with someone going in and expressing an opinion, but as soon as he starts saying that this is nuanced, this is deep, this is something that I can hang my hat on, this is I've thought things through to the nth degree, and then it becomes blatantly obvious that I haven't thought things through to the nth degree, or maybe, you know, it's possible to go to a much higher end, and I just haven't done it. That kind of reeks of hubris, and I don't like it. So of course, maybe I'm the arrogant one. Maybe I'm the person that goes and thinks, oh, what in the world is going on? He quite literally posits a sleight of hand on the part of the Marxists soon after the philosophy was supposedly disavowed among the academics, entailing the replacement of the rich-poor conflict with an observably vaguer oppression-oppressor conflict. So Peterson genuinely posits an observable translation of thought from one pseudonym to another, executive for the survival of the fundamental rudimentary ideology. But this demonstrates that Mr. Orsmond perhaps hasn't looked too much into Marxist-Leninism. The understanding of Marx from the view of Lenin and the way that it has gone and permeated universities, and what the ultimate end game is, right? This philosophy, especially when you want to, completely destroys me. Oh dear. Oh dear. I see my connection went for a while. Well, I'll go and I'll recap what I said this last little bit. And it's that Mr. Orsmond has misrepresented Peterson by saying that Peterson takes an overly simplistic look, or that that Peterson is saying that postmodernism exists as effectively nothing less than veiled Marxism, and that Mr. Orsmond now claims to have a more nuanced view on the matter, and perhaps he does. But I would say that he hasn't gone and looked at all the nuances, and specifically hasn't looked at the objectives that Marxists have, especially those in the vein of Lenin. Regardless of what the name is, people have a particular utopian ideology, a particular utopian set of ideals that people believe will be accomplished by forcing the collectivization, getting people used to it, and then ultimately getting rid of the government, and then letting people, you know, smoke weed and sing Imagine or something like that. I'm not entirely certain, but there is a general progression that Marxists believe is going to take place. And so what postmodernism does is ultimately rejecting, taking the perspective of rejecting reason in as much as it doesn't essentially match up with feelings. And yeah, I might be overly simplifying a little bit, but that's the crux of it. That's the basics of it. So whether or not it was invented by Marxists and then all the names just got removed, or whether or not it was just something that that simultaneously evolved out of going and seeing all sorts of abject failures of the 20th century, philosophical failures of the 20th century, historical failures of the 20th century that are ultimately predicated upon Enlightenment BS, and then adopting it is something else. So you can wind up. So basically, what I'm saying is that there is a great utility for socialists. There's great utility for socialists to go, for Marxists to go and say, well, this doesn't work. This has been completely disproven. However, even though this has been completely disproven, facts aren't real. Reason isn't. Reason needs to be subservient to my will, to my emotion, to my, I know that communism is good. I know that communism is good. I know that socialism is the way to get there. And I don't care how many times people try it and how many times people do mass murdering. Let's just go and overlook that and try again. Try again. We'll get it. And postmodernism provides the framework where people can go and forget the past, where people can neglect the lessons of history, where people can go and just say, well, socialism makes me feel good, therefore socialism, or communism makes me feel good, therefore socialism is good, therefore we should do it. And being ignorant of the fact that this is the modus operandi, this is the way that Marxists, especially Marxist-Leninists, have gone and hijacked postmodernism as a way of perpetuating the underlying ideology without actually needing to be able to reasonably substantiate it, shows me that Mr. Orsman has a little more reading to do, or a little more learning to do before he can go and actually provide an educated or thorough opinion on the matter. Now granted, I myself am oversimplifying the situation a bit, but at least I'm not here saying that I'm the only person that has a nuanced view and that... You see, I just have to be careful not to fall into the same trap that Mr. Orsman does. But I think, and this is just conjecture on my part, but I think that somebody as intelligent as Jordan Peterson can't have missed what Mr. Orsman clearly did miss. And based upon previous patterns of thinking that I've observed within Peterson, especially given the fact that, you know, he's a centrist. He's what people a decade ago or 2 decades ago would have called a centrist. Would have been able to think. So Peterson genuinely posits an observable translation of thought from one pseudonym to another, executive for the survival of the fundamental rudimentary ideology. Yes. Put aside the fact that the incentivization required to lead to such profound translation of thought was simply not there at the time of the foundations postmodernism was set. You didn't need. First off, the way ideas interact with each other is much more complex than just, you didn't need it. Well, of course you did need it at the time. Of course you did need it. Of course it was necessary because people were seeing socialism crumble before their very eyes. If people know that the only way you can actually get socialism to work on any wide scale is at the point of a gun, with the threat of extinction, that is, you need to go and find some way, if you're still a diehard socialist, of coming to terms with that reality. And so this paragraph is completely an inaccuracy. And this particular inaccuracy is what really, really bothers me, is because it seems that people don't actually, especially Mr. Horseman, doesn't actually understand this whole expediency thing. The truly nonsensical part of this theory is that Peterson surmised that Marxists in need of new identity substituted their wealth inequality narrative with a more generalized inequality narrative predicated upon oppression. Well, that is a wealth inequality narrative. It still always has been. It's just now we go and use our fees to determine to determine how rich somebody is, as opposed to some sort of more objective measure in terms of actually calculating one's net worth. But since value is subjective, you can kind of already do that. Implicit in this is the idea that the single attribute that makes one a Marxist is simply an identification of conflict, which is simply not true. Well, what makes one a Marxist is simply it's a reactionary ideology. It's reactionary to what ultimately winds up being crony capitalism. The idea completely ignores the fact that postmodernism is actually a direct negation of Marxism in innumerable foundational respects. So to be a Marxist in transition to postmodernism is to undercut your previously held ideology at its most fundamental level. Depending on how you view fundamental level, I can concede that point. In spite of all that I said, I can concede that point, depending on how you understand the term fundamental. But if fundamental is understood to be biological in nature, if fundamental is actually understood to be, I want to level the Pareto distribution. If the understanding is that I don't like the people who are in, the Pareto distribution essentially says that you can fit into a football stadium half of the wealth producers in the world, or the people that produce half of the wealth of the world. I don't like that group of people. I wish I were in that group of people. I wish I were top of the heap. So you wind up having those kinds of opportunists. Then you have all the other people that are discontented with their relatively low position, even though the rising tide helps all ships, raises all ships. You wind up getting a bunch of discontent people using this as an excuse to live out their envy. You have a bunch of discontent people using this as an excuse to remove the 1% and then assume the roles in a game with new rules that you're hoping will allow you to climb, even though you're not producing as much as the people that can produce more. Ultimately, this is predicated upon a completely wrong idea that we're all the same. A completely wrong idea that we're all the same. And that the only thing that makes person A different from person B is that either person A stole from person B, or that person A was born into more favorable circumstances than person B. What people fail to mention is that in a truly free market, social mobility really is a thing. Now, of course you can wind up having people that are discontented and people that refuse to believe that a rising tide raises all ships, simply because monkey brain is coming and saying, status monkey says that person way up in stratosphere bad. That is the fundamental level. That is the fundamental level. You wind up having the working class of people that don't want to go and take the time to sit and think about it because there's more effort. Or rather, they don't want to go and sit and think about it because it goes and shines a light on our own inadequacies. I mean, I'm not at the top of the hierarchy by any stretch of the imagination. I'm on the top of some hierarchies I occupy, and at the bottom or in the middle of others. I don't know if I'm at the bottom of any of them, but I'm not. And I don't try to be necessarily the top of anything that doesn't actually matter to me. But not being able to be a winner by the current rules of the game incentivizes changing the rules of the game. And if you wind up having to change the philosophical goalpost, if you wind up having to go and change the actual ideology at its most fundamental level in the way that we're talking about here, that means that there is one level more fundamental still, and that is that of status monkey. That is that of satiating the status monkey. Satiating the status monkey is the reason that people subscribe to communism and therefore to socialism. And that's all it ever has been. Just the way the status monkey is satisfied is a little bit different depending upon what kind of a person you are, whether or not you're a starry-eyed idealist, an opportunist, or somebody who is just disgruntled. Then he goes and labels the conflicts between the contrasting ideologies, which I concede. However, the fact this person fails to account for human nature and fails to account for basic biology, fails to account for the relationship that we have to the Pareto principle, indicates that there's a lot more to be learned about this particular situation than to be able to go and make such a declarative, boom, this is the way it is, kind of a statement. And so you go and you see there are all these different people reading into and buying into this particular load of horse crap. And that kind of bothers me because it shows that people really don't give an analysis. It just shows that people analyze to the point where they feel comfortable, and that's it. Which ultimately goes back to our original discussion of what is a god. What is a god? And ultimately it is in service to whatever it is we see as a god. And I'll repeat this for the sake of the people that haven't, that may not have been in the stream at the beginning. My understanding of a god is explained as follows. A god means that from which we are to expect all good and in which we are to take refuge in all distress. So to have a god is nothing other than trusting and believing him with the heart. So expecting all good and taking refuge from in distress, communism is a god. Socialism is a means of imposing force, of using the guns of the government to enforce at least a certain degree of equal allocation of the means of production. That is now the end of my little rant. So now we'll go and see what winds up happening. Oh boy. I'll go and I'll read what everybody has been saying for the past half an hour or so. Mr. Sanderson says we should analyze the use of verbiage. Mr. Boothby says Peterson seems today's version of 1980s Robert Bly in the men's movement and a bit of Campbell of the 90s. Diagnoses that men are lost without circumcision, aka male initiation. Some people aren't willing to understand other positions, says Mr. Sanderson. It means you don't have to think about anything. Mr. Boothby says thinking leads to suicide. Is better to avoid it. Mr. Sanderson says thinking is useful if you can use it practically. Thinking without acting is practical and doesn't give you any way of attaining something tangible. And then he goes and corrects impractical. Thinking without acting is impractical. It doesn't give you any way of attaining something tangible. Mr. Boothby then says, if by practically use it, you mean barely. Well, that's me. If I could think, I probably'd enjoy it. And then suicide. Mr. I'm Only Jesting says, listening while working on chemistry. Mr. Boothby says, brainwashing requires the flattening of hierarchies of thought and information in a person. Postmodernists seem to want to do this to society. Mr. Boothby says, book burning and purges, here comes Evergreen. In a game of Monopoly, little skill is required to win, to benefit from Pareto. In society, the idea is to keep the innovation going, keep it refreshing itself. Pareto can stultify society. Pareto seems like a standalone way of ensuring talent is what ends up on top. It isn't. It's just a status monkey. It's not just a status monkey problem. Sounds way too simplified. Well, it is a little, it is nuanced in a certain sense, but then ultimately you have to think about what is value. You have to go to the abstract idea of what is value. And Pareto isn't a standalone way of ensuring talent is what ends up on top. It's just the Pareto distribution is just a statement of fact. But in a game of Monopoly, if you don't know, so we'll go back to the game of Monopoly instance. If you don't know what properties are likely to yield the highest return, you don't know what to do in order to get the appropriate exponential growth. If you don't know how to play the game, you're still going to screw up. Now, granted, the barrier to entry is very low, but life is not a game of Monopoly, because as soon as somebody figures something out, there's this thing called a brain that we can use to go and figure out different versions, to innovate, to adapt. Pareto doesn't stultify society because wealth is what we define wealth to be. Money is a measure of wealth that we can all that except a particular currency system can agree upon. But ultimately, if I go and I wind up having a windfall of money, or I wind up having a consistent income, which would be better. If let's just say I have a consistent income of $1 billion per year, $1 billion per year, what do I do with it? I do what my value system says I should. Whatever I value is what I wind up spending the money on. Whatever I value is what I end up spending my time in. That is my definition of riches. That is my definition of wealth. If for some people it might mean traveling. For other people it might mean space exploration. For other people it might mean drinking and drugs. For other people it might mean building new businesses. For other people, there are all sorts of different things that our value system tells us to go seek. And whatever our value system tells us to go seek, that is what we're ultimately going to wind up doing with our money. So we would need to have our value system being congruent with that which the rest of the world, congruent with reality in order to be able to function within reality. And because people's value systems aren't congruent with reality, that is ultimately what causes people to not be able to climb the social hierarchy. Because as soon as people stop valuing whatever it is that the people at the top provide, then people can be out. As soon as people find another way of getting it for better, for cheaper and so on, the people at the top are out in a free market. That's the way it works. And so the top 1% is constantly fluctuating in a free market. You may be in the top 1% one year and aren't the next year. And that's the thing that people fail to mention, is that though the distribution remains Pareto-esque in nature, especially if the market is free, who is at what part of the distribution can change, can and does readily change. Anti-monopoly laws are stupid. And I'm going to go and take this very, very hard look on it, because ultimately, if someone is producing, if it is a naturally occurring monopoly, if the monopoly occurs in the free market, it can be broken by the free market. However, that's not what takes place. Monopolies occur when people who have achieved something go, or at least monopolies insofar as they're understood now. And the traditional definition of monopoly is ultimately one that is sanctioned and enforced by the government. The banking sector, regulating the finance sector, is one example of that. If you wind up having the finance sector being able to essentially regulate itself by having its own representatives writing the laws and interpreting the laws, then you wind up establishing an authority that can be indirectly and sometimes directly enforced at gunpoint. If you wind up necessitating that you pay taxes with a particular currency, and this currency is only printed by the central bank, well, then that leaves the central bank with all the power in the world when it comes to certain things, unless you are doing transactions outside of that, or just spending the money on assets as soon as you get it. So if you have the finance sector, which is heavily regulated, that means that whoever is in the finance sector currently is basically in a position of being too big to fail, is in a position of being a government-sanctioned monopoly. I can't go and say, here, use my currency. Here, let's have a gold standard. Here, do that, because if I go and I try to go and have an economy based on gold, nobody's going to accept gold to pay taxes. Nobody's going to accept gold to pay taxes. And so there isn't a free market. But ultimately, it has nothing to do. It has nothing to do. The monopoly in the current finance sector has nothing to do with it being a free market phenomenon. That is a phenomenon of government. The same with agricultural firms and conglomerates and so on coming together and coming with all these different rules that people have to follow. It's because their compliance costs are nil compared to their income, but the compliance costs would be horrible for somebody trying to go into the field. And so the government perpetuates the monopoly. The government allows for it because ultimately what you wind up doing is having people purchasing government power for a small cut of what it is that they make. Now, if the government were smaller, if that power didn't exist for politicians to use, then the free market forces would work. The free market forces would work in that particular scenario. So, yeah, cable TV, exactly. And needing to get permits to do all sorts of different things. Who sets the terms? It's not just government agents that set the terms for this. Government agents do so at the bequest of people that have already made it, that can pay them off. And that is why I hate monopolies. But going and then saying no monopolies, going and having a law that says no monopolies, no, that's just going to go and make things even worse, because then you can wind up having somebody going and hiding the fact that they're a monopoly by doing things under multiple names and whatnot, having all sorts of different subsidiaries, having their structures being hidden from the public eye, and being able to avoid all the anti-monopoly laws while still effectually being a monopoly. The situation is much more complex, and ultimately we need to go back to the basic biological impulses to climb the social ladder, to climb the totem pole, in order to make sense of this whole thing. All people have animal brains, not all people have morals. Well, then the morals wind up being congruent with what the animal brain says. Exactly. You met some non-moral people. Scary. People don't believe they exist. Well, I would say non-moral people do have a certain morality. It might be fluctuating and it might be biological in nature, but it is a morality. And I don't mean amorality, it is morality. But as soon as we go and we start using words like amoral, now there are certain things that don't necessarily fit into a particular moral structure as being good or bad or preferable, if they don't ever enter into conversation at all. But ultimately, as soon as somebody imputes more value to one thing than to another in any given circumstance, that winds up going and necessarily imposing a very complicated system of values on the entire thing. Get rid of government and we armed folks can use our militias to invade Libya. Wow. This is really cool, though. I'm glad that we've been able to have this particular conversation. This has been fun. We've now been going for about an hour and 26 minutes. So I'll suggest that we wrap this up in the next 4 minutes or so. So if we have anything else that we'd like to bring up, now would be the time to do so. I'll be silent for a little while and see what happens. Oh yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't. I didn't. Plato's Allegory of the Cave. That's tough. That's tough. And I definitely can't say it in 4 minutes. So I will. I will promise you that tomorrow we will talk both about the Iliad Book II, lines lines 406 and following, and we will talk about Plato's Allegory of the Cave, among other things. I promise that we will talk about those two things tomorrow during the stream. I think that Plato's Allegory of the Cave is, you can understand it on many different levels. And I buy it on some levels, but don't buy it on others. If that's, it's just so stinking abstract that, my answer to that is so abstract that I'm not going to be able to flesh it out in time. I'm sorry, Mr. Sanderson, I can't do it justice today, but I will get to it. I promise that. Well, things do seem to be winding down. Thank you, everyone, for your patience. Thank you for showing up. And look forward then to, assuming the end of the world doesn't happen, assuming we don't have a gigantic pulse that obliterates our infrastructure, assuming we don't deal with intense bursts of solar radiation, assuming that the world doesn't come to an end, we'll see you, or that we all make it through to tomorrow in some way. Assuming that all those things take place, see you tomorrow. Talk to you later.